Well, thanks everybody for coming today. I know Zoom isn't the ideal way to have presentations, but we'll do the best we can. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and if people raise their little hand icon, but it is a little tough to watch that sometimes. So if I miss your question, please don't take it personally and make sure you get it in at the end. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done with colleagues at Arizona State University as well as the University of Leeds, looking at ultra-low velocity zones specifically beneath the Southern Hemisphere. My slides will advance. So we, meaning both scientists and sort of the general public at large, have sort of been fascinated with the interior of our planet for a long time. And it's been long recognized that the Earth's core-mantle boundary represents a really major contrast in a lot of physical properties: temperature, chemistry, viscosity, even phase. So a lot of these discoveries have dated back many years now. For example, in 1906, Richard Dixon Oldham discovered the presence of the Earth's core. And about 20 years after that, in 1926, Harold Jeffreys determined that the core, at least the outer core, was liquid. So these were some pretty notable discoveries in early seismology. But even kind of aside from the seismic and scientific aspects of the CMB, again, kind of general public's been really interested in what's happening inside our planet for a long time. There have been more recreations of the Journey to the Center of the Earth movie than I can count. These date back all the way to 1959, which is actually my favorite version. But of course, then you've got the more recent ones as well. So there's a lot of interest in this topic and what's happening inside our planet. So because you have such this major contrast at the core-mantle boundary, there's a lot of interesting features down there. But today we're going to focus on one particular type of structure, which are known as ultra-low velocity zones, or ULVZs. So ULVZs are small-scale, laterally varying structures that have, at least in some locations, been seismically imaged just above the core-mantle boundary. And the map here on the right, which I borrowed from a 2018 paper by you and Garnero, illustrates the locations where prior ULVZ studies have been focused. So on this map, the areas kind of highlighted in red indicate where ULVZ evidence was detected or found. Those in blue are where they did not find evidence for ULVZs, and those in yellow had uncertain results. I'll also point out kind of these big pink areas on this map. Those mark what are known as large low shear velocity provinces, and I'll come back to those in just a little bit. So generally speaking, ULVZs are characterized by pretty dramatic reductions in both P and S wave seismic velocities and are usually associated with an increase in density. That said, across these different studies that have been conducted, there's a pretty significant range of ULVZ characteristics that have been suggested. So I've just summarized those here on the left. The thickness of ULVZs have been reported to vary anywhere from 5 up to 100 kilometers. Their lateral extent, or their width, again, ranges quite a bit from 100 maybe all the way up to about 1,000 kilometers. And you can see the pretty dramatic decreases in both P and S wave velocity here. P velocity is usually decreased from about 5 to 20%, while S velocity is about 7 to 50%. And density increases up to about 20% have been reported. So again, a pretty significant range of characteristics. This, of course, has led to a lot of questions about what are ULVZs? What are these things? What's the source mechanism? And how do they relate to the thermochemical processes and situation down in the lowermost mantle? And the uncertainties associated with ULVZs are somewhat exacerbated by the fact that only about 20% of the core-mantle boundary has actually been probed for ULVZ presence. There's a lot of questions still about what these features are, and again, what can they tell us about large-scale Earth dynamics and deep Earth processes. So there's been a number of different source mechanisms suggested to explain what ULVZs might be associated with. One possible explanation is that ULVZs are kind of associated with thermal anomalies along the core mantle boundary, possibly associated with some degree of partial melt. And this interpretation has come about because a number of studies have reported an approximate 3-to-1 VS to VP reduction ratio, which again is pretty consistent with some degree of partial melting in the lowermost mantle. So if they are associated with, again, these thermal anomalies, partial melt, what's causing them? Well, of course, the temperatures are pretty significant down near the core mantle boundary, so that of course contributes to this. But usually you have to have something else playing in because the pressures are also very high at those depths, of course. And so things like enhanced water content or even potentially localized shearing between the mantle and the core could help promote partial melting. And so because this idea has been put forth and that you might have partial melt along the CMB, it's also been put forth that ULVZs may actually sort of seed or feed, if you will, mantle plumes. And so this sketch here on the left is a cartoon from Juan and Romanowitz 2017, where they're illustrating how these dark red patches, which are the ULVZs, again, may be the source of mantle plumes or mantle upwellings. Now that said, they have found ULVZs outside these presumably hotter portions of the lowermost mantle, in which case that would not be as consistent with a thermal source. And so for ULVZs identified in these colder regions, typically some type of compositional anomaly is used to explain the source of the ULVZs. One possible mechanism that might lead to such a compositional anomaly are chemical interactions between the silicate mantle and the iron core, leading to iron enriched material. And that's what this picture here, kind of in the middle of the slide, is meant to represent. This is a cartoon from a study by Mao et al. 2006, illustrating, again, sort of this chemical interaction where you get iron enriched post-perovskite that might be associated with ULVZ structure. Another possible source of compositional heterogeneity along the CMB, which again may contribute to ULVZs, are subducted materials. So if those subducted materials, including morb, mid-ocean ridge basalts, oceanic sediments, and so forth, actually reach the lowermost mantle, it's expected that these would stand out as compositional anomalies. The other plot here on the lower right is a graph from Hiroshi's 2006 study. And what you're looking at here, there's depth along the top axis, pressure along the bottom, so whichever one you prefer. And the vertical axis is rock density. The dashed line here is the expected change in density with, again, increasing depth or increasing pressure for sort of a standard Earth model called PREM, primary reference Earth model. The solid line, which is fit to the data points that you see, is the expected change in density, again, with depth or pressure for morb, mid-ocean ridge basalt. And what these results indicated was that subducted morb is significantly denser than sort of average lower mantle material. So again, this might provide some sort of compositional anomaly that could be tied to ULVZs. It's also been suggested that there is some type of relationship or connection between ULVZs and those large low shear velocity provinces that I mentioned a few minutes ago, or also known as LLSVPs. There's a lot of acronyms, I'll try to keep them straight. So the map here on the upper left is just another representation of those large low shear velocity provinces. This is a tomographic map, a seismic tomography model at 2,800 kilometers depth. Areas in sort of red and yellow are slow and presumably hotter, and those more in the blue color are seismically faster, so thought to be cooler. And you can see these two areas right here and right here labeled the African and Pacific LLSVPs. So there are two of these very large scale structures that extend actually hundreds of kilometers above the core mantle boundary that have been recognized in many different global tomography models. Much larger scale, of course, than the ULVZs. That said, a number of studies have suggested that ULVZs have been found either within or along the edges of these larger scale LLSVPs. And so that's what the cartoon here on the bottom is meant to illustrate. The little yellow area right here is meant to represent a small scale ULVZ, again, on the edge of the larger scale LLSVP. And so the concept here is that you have this distinct ULVZ material that's swept by convection currents through the mantle, moving them towards these large scale anomalies, these big upwellings, and that the ULVZs then accumulate along the boundaries of the LLSVPs. So kind of armed with that background, our goal for the study I'm going to present today was to expand ULVZ investigations, particularly in the southernmost hemisphere. And specifically, if you look at the map here on the right, we're kind of focusing on the area within this bold dashed circle. So this is very similar to the maps I've shown you before. The background, again, is seismic tomography. The red areas that are sort of enclosed by these purple lines, those are those LLSVPs that I mentioned a minute ago. And the red, blue, and now green markers are, again, the locations of prior ULVZ studies. So you'll notice, while there is some ULVZ sampling within this circle, within the southernmost hemisphere, some of which, a lot of these dots up here, a previous study that I did, sampling in this part of the world and this part of the core-mantle boundaries is pretty sparse. This area is also quite unique because not only is it far away from, again, these big red blobs, the two LLSVPs, but it's also an area that's not really associated with current or recent subduction. So our goal here was to combine both seismic analyses and geodynamic modeling to further investigate and map potential ULVZ structure in this part of the core-mantle boundary, and then to build upon that to try to lend further insight into what, plausible ULVZ origin mechanisms might be. So to do this project, I've employed data from a seismic array that I deployed in Antarctica back in 2012 to 2015. And the map here on the left illustrates the layout and the location of that array. This array is known as TAMNet, which stands for the Transantarctic Mountains Northern Network, given where it's located. The purple triangles here are each of the 15 seismic stations that were run for 3 years down on the ice. And just to kind of help orient you, the inset here shows the full continent of Antarctica, and that little red polygon is where the larger scale station map is located. So TAMNet was actually set up not for this type of study at all. It was actually intended and used to do more crustal and upper mantle structure type investigation related to the Transantarctic Mountains. But it's actually proved to be a really fruitful data set, and we've been able to expand upon that and do some other things with this, including the work that I'm going to talk about today. So we're looking at core reflected PCP phases that have been recorded by the TAMNet array, again, to try to map out ULVZ structures beneath the southern hemisphere. So the reason we're employing PCP phases is because when there is a ULVZ present above the core-mantle boundary, you get some interesting features that occur that allow us to map out that structure. And that's what's illustrated in the cartoons here on the right. So in both of these panels, which are just separated for clarity, kind of the heavy blue line that you see here is the main PCP phase. And as you can see, it's a phase that is reflecting or bouncing off the outer core, so the core-mantle boundary. That said, when you have a ULVZ present, this green layer with some thickness H, you get reflections both from the top of the ULVZ, sort of the mantle ULVZ boundary, as well as sort of reflections and reverberations inside that ULVZ layer. And so these lead to pre and post cursor signals that arrive before and after, respectively, the main PCP phase. And ultimately, then we can model the timing and the amplitude of those pre and post cursors to get at the ULVZ structure. So as you might imagine, there's a few challenges with doing this type of work. Just to, again, kind of orient everyone here, the cartoon here in the middle illustrates the ray paths between an earthquake and some receiver for both the direct P wave going straight from source to receiver, and of course our PCP wave reflecting or bouncing off the core-mantle boundary. This little pink box is meant to highlight the region I showed you in the previous slide, where again you might have interaction with a ULVZ. And you'll notice that there's sort of a gray line here labeled PKP, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So identifying PCP phases and using them to do interpretation and modeling can be kind of challenging. PCP phases generally have fairly low amplitudes, and they can potentially have fairly low signal to noise ratios, or SNRs. Just as a comparison, or just as an example, the panel here on the right just provides an example of both a direct P wave and a PCP wave that were recorded by one of the TAMNET stations for an example earthquake. And you can see how the amplitudes of these two compare. Obviously, P is quite a bit bigger than PCP. Part of this is because, coming back to PKP here, a lot of the energy that would go into making our phase of interest actually continues into the outer core. So unlike, say, an S wave, you don't get as sharp or as dramatic a reflection at that interface. Also, because of course PCP comes in after P, you can get sort of noise in the P coda that can lower the signal to noise ratio PCP. So we need, in order to do our analysis, we need to have robust PCP waveform stacks in order to really reliably interpret and model the ULVZ structure that we're interested in. So in order to develop those types of stacks, my colleague and I developed what's known as HIPR, or the Historical Interstation Pattern Referencing Approach. And the methodology paper associated with HIPR came out just at the end of 2021. It was published in JGR. The flow chart here on the right, I know this is a bit busy, but these illustrate the main steps of the HIPR technique. I don't really have time to go through all of this in detail today, but if it's something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend looking at that JGR paper, and I'm happy to provide copies. But in a nutshell, what HIPR does is it uses both travel time and data quality measurements from all of our data of interest, so all of our event station pairs. And using those measurements, we basically develop a catalog of historical patterns. You know, how do those measurements vary across the data set as a whole? And we then compare individual measurements from any particular earthquake or station to that historical pattern, historical catalog. And so ultimately, by taking the individual interstation measurement differences, again, compared to these historical averages, we can use that to develop both event and station weights that better reflect the quality of our data. And those weights are then used to weigh the individual, in our case, PCP waveforms to generate really high quality PCP waveform stacks, which then again, in our case, we're using for modeling and interpretation for ULVZ structure. So just to provide a few associated images and some examples. The top panel here, these are again, of course, the TAMNET stations, but the triangles here, the stations are color-coded by their HIPR-based station weights. Most of the stations have kind of a dark brown or red color, indicating they have a pretty high weight. I'll point out the first station on the line here, which stands for Donatello. Yes, I named my stations after the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So this particular station happened to be situated on a moving glacier and had a few issues. So it's interesting that you can see that in the station weights. The two panels on the bottom here, each of these circles represents the average PCP reflection or bounce point for a given earthquake off the core-mantle boundary. And they're color-coded by their corresponding event weights. Specifically, panel B shows the P-based event weight, and panel C shows the PCP-based event weight. So again, all of these weights then get factored into our data to make our high-quality stacks. Speaking of which, here's an example of some of the data from TAMNet. The column on the left are the P records, the column on the right are PCP. Down to, I'm going to ignore the last two traces for just a second, but each one of these is an individual P or PCP waveform for an example event. Again, and these are the station names here on the left. The second to the last trace, the one that says initial stack, that is the stack that we obtained before HIPR, before the weights were employed, using sort of more a quasi-traditional stacking approach. And then the very last trace is the HIPR weighted stack, again for both P and PCP, where the shading indicates 1 standard deviation. So this provides kind of a nice illustration of how HIPR can lead to higher quality stacks, particularly for PCP. If you look at the initial stack versus the final one, the PCP arrival is a heck of a lot more clear. And so HIPR proved to be very useful in identifying events that we could use for our ULVZ analysis. Now that said, when I started this work, there were 822 events that I initially started playing with to look for PCP signals and to potentially use for ULVZ assessment. But as we went through the data and the HIPR approach, we realized that some events had to get kicked out for a couple of reasons. Specifically, if an event had a P arrival that was very emergent, very low signal to noise ratio, or very complex, we decided to not use that because it made it very challenging when we went into our synthetic modeling, and I'll get back to that in just a sec. If we did not have enough station records to make a robust stack, where we didn't think the stack was reliable, we decided to dismiss that event as well. In some cases, you have to worry about other interfering seismic phases, say like little p, little sp, sorry, little pp, little sp, or pp. If those phases arrive at about the same time as, say, PCP, it makes it very difficult to kind of tease that signal apart. And we also enforced that all of our HIPR weighted PCP stacks had to have signal to noise ratios greater than 1.5. If they didn't, again, we decided not to use them because we didn't think the signal was robust enough. So once we kind of dismissed events that had these particular issues, we ultimately ended up with 227 TAMNet recorded earthquakes that, again, we use for our ULVZ assessment. And I'll note that about 15% of those were sort of quote unquote salvaged, if you will, using the HIPR-based weighting scheme. Meaning if we had just gone with the initial stacks, like I showed you a moment ago, those events probably would have gotten kicked out because the PCP wasn't clear enough to work with. And so HIPR actually put a fairly significant number of events back into play, so to speak, that we had more data to work with. So that was really useful. So once we narrowed down the events of interest, we then wanted to do some synthetic modeling to try to get at, again, what is the ULVZ structure. To do this, we used our HIPR weighted P stacks, and we extracted a P wavelet from those stacks, which were corrected for attenuation and polarity. I can talk about that more later if people are interested. We then convolve those P wavelets with synthetic responses that were expected for a huge range of ULVZ models. So basically, all of the range of ULVZ characteristics I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, different thicknesses, different density changes, different velocity reductions, we created these synthetic spike trains for all these different combinations of models, and again, convolve that with the P wavelet to make a synthetic expected response for that model. So in total, for every event, we tested over 38,000 different ULVZ models. To assess the fit between the actual data and the synthetic data, we computed a QC value, or comparison quality value, which is based on this relationship here. CCC is the cross-correlation coefficient between the synthetic and the observed PCP waveforms. G is what we're terming a goodness of fit measurement. Again, if you're interested in the details of that, I would point you to the 2021 JGR paper. It goes into a little more detail there. So here's some examples. Over here on the left, panel A, this is kind of similar to an image I showed you before. Again, you're looking at the first column is the P waves, and then the right column is the PCP waves, again, for an example event recorded by TAMNet. All the way down until the very last trace. Each one of these are the individual waveform records, again, recorded by a TAMNet station. The very last trace at the bottom of the columns here are the Hipper weighted P and PCP stacks, where the gray shading again indicates one standard deviation. If we move up to panel B, the solid or heavy black line here is again our Hipper based PCP stack. So essentially the same as this lowermost trace on the PCP column on the left. So that's our observed data. And then the red and green lines are synthetic PCP responses from our best fit model, as well as the PREM model, where the PREM model does not contain a ULVZ. So basically we're looking at how much better does a ULVZ inclusive model fit the data compared to a non-ULVZ inclusive model. Just for reference, these values right here indicate the characteristics of the best fit ULVZ model. And I'll draw your attention to this little arrow right here, which is pointing at this bump. That's one of those PCP precursors that I mentioned a little earlier in the talk. Panel C here, the histogram indicates those CQ or comparison quality values, again, measures of fit for all 38,000 plus synthetic models that we examined. Just for reference, the fit of PREM, again, without a ULVZ, is marked by the green line. And then the orange line right here that says best average is the average CQ over the top 100 best fit models for this particular event. A few other details here. We have the PCP stack signal to noise ratio, the average CQ value, again, where this orange line plots. And in this particular case, CQ percent improvement is how much better does a ULVZ model fit this data or this event compared to a non-ULVZ model. So in this particular example, it fits about 17% better. The last couple of panels here in D are plots of the, again, this is the top 100 best fit models for this particular event. And we're plotting the ULVZ characteristics, so both thickness, shear wave velocity reduction, and P wave velocity reduction. I realize it looks like there's not 100 dots on here, but the reason that's the case is because any model that only varies by change in density is going to plot on top of one another. So some of these dots, there's multiple dots stacked on top of each other. So we went through this analysis for every single event that, again, we decided to use for our ULVZ assessment. And so our results are summarized in the large map here on the right. Like some of the previous maps, each one of these dots corresponds to the average PCP reflection or bounce point on the core-mantle boundary. If the dot is red, it was interpreted as having robust ULVZ evidence. And to do that, we enforced a couple of criteria. Specifically, in order to robustly show ULVZ structure, we required an average CQ value bigger than 0.2. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but both the CCC, the cross-correlation coefficient, and goodness of fit values that go into computing CQ are both less than 1. So when you multiply two little numbers together, you get kind of a really little number. And so actually a fit of 0.2 is pretty high. Further, we enforced the criteria that the CQ improvement over PREM, again, a non-ULVZ model, had to be bigger than 10%. So again, red dots meet all of our criteria, show robust ULVZ structure. The yellow dots are considered uncertain results because they fell below this 10% threshold. They're usually still best fit by a ULVZ model, but we don't have a high enough improvement in fit compared to PREM to definitively say, yes, that's ULVZ. So as you can see, our sampling points, our PCP points, kind of spread over a pretty big geographic area. And so we decided to separate them into geographic families, which are highlighted by the colored boxes on this map. And then within each of those families, we kind of subset things a bit further and basically used circular bins to group together the PCP bounce points on the core. So the bottom map here is just one example of one of our geographic families. This is Tasmania and the southeast corner of Australia, and the gray just for reference. Each one of the dots is meant to represent a 2-degree radius bin, which was then moved from one grid location to another over a 2x2 degree grid. We found all of the PCP bounce points that fell within that bin, and then computed a weighted CQ value, very similar to the CQ I mentioned before, to find the best fit ULVZ parameters in that bin. So in this particular example, the bins are color coded by the VS reduction associated with that ULVZ structure. And so by doing this, we were able to look at variability in ULVZ structure across the geographic family or within the family. We also decided to take each family and kind of find an average ULVZ value so that we could report a family value with corresponding error bars. And that's the plots shown here on the right. So again, we're plotting the ULVZ characteristics, thickness, VS reduction, VP reduction, and they're color coded the same way. So the colors, again, correspond to the different families. There is overlap, of course, but there is some distinct differences from one family to another that do stand out as well. So what our analysis has shown us, both within the geographic families and across the geographic families, we have pretty good evidence, pretty strong evidence for variable ULVZ structure across the southernmost hemisphere. Now, one thing I will mention, which is related to this bottom picture here, is that we do have trade-offs in our modeling. It's very common that a thinner, more anomalous ULVZ is going to fit your data equally well as a thicker, less anomalous ULVZ. And you can see that in the scatter plots in panels B through D here. These are the same as I showed you before. I've just separated out the dots based on their change in density values. So you can see, again, these are the top 100 best fit models, but you can see the variability a little more now. And then a lot of them fall on these trend lines, right? So we have this trade-off that is a little difficult to get around. Given that, it is very hard to say definitively what the ULVZ characteristics are in any one location. But even with that, again, we have really strong evidence for ULVC structure throughout the Southern Hemisphere that's variable from place to place. So, okay, we found evidence for ULVZ structure. These are the same dots that I showed you just a moment ago. Again, the red dots are our robust results, yellow dots are our uncertain results, again, plotted at their average PCP bounce points on the core. You'll notice, again, the background here is the same tomography model I showed you previously. And a majority of our sampling points, and hence our ULVZs, are located within a seismically fast, in other words, sort of presumably cooler part of the lowermost mantle, again, away from the LLSVPs, which, just as a reminder, are these red areas encompassed by the purple dashed lines. And so the question becomes, okay, if this is a area that's presumably cooler and hence maybe not as consistent with a thermal origin for ULVZs, what's causing these, right? I will point out, and I mentioned this earlier, that this area is also not associated with present-day subduction. But the circum-Pacific subduction system has been pretty active over the last 200 million years and maybe more. So one thought we had was, well, could subducted materials from nearby subduction zones be moved into this region and explain our variable ULVZ structure? So with that in mind, my colleague at Arizona State University, Ming Li, built some geodynamic models to try to assess this. Again, can materials from adjacent nearby subduction zones be moved into the lower mantle in our study region and hence explain the variable ULVZ structure that we see? So I have a video here that I'm going to show you from his model. Before I set this up, I'll note that there are tracers basically inserted into the shallow part of the model space that then are passively advected into the lower mantle, driven by a plate tectonic model that he's built into this. As you can see, the model is going to start at about 450 MA. It will run up to present day. The vectors indicate the direction and rate of motion in the lower 300 kilometers of the mantle. So you're looking right above the core-mantle boundary. And as I start this, I'll go ahead and do that. You're going to start seeing colors showing up here, kind of gets brown and then more blue, which is basically indicating the number of tracers in any one particular area. So in other words, these tracers are meant to represent subducted materials that are getting pulled down into the lower mantle and spread across the core-mantle boundary. And what you'll see as this continues is that we end up with subducted material kind of all over the place. Of course, it's variable, right? There's darker bluish green colors in some locations than in others, meaning you have more tracers or more subducted material in those locations. And, where it's concentrated varies quite a bit. But this shows, that it's very likely, we've just hit present day here, that we have subducted materials spread all across the core-mantle boundary. So this could be a good explanation for the variable ULVZ structure that we've observed. If we take this a step further, it's kind of intriguing because subduction has actually been going on for billions of years, presumably, on our planet. This model only covers about 450 million years. And if that's the case, it's very possible that the entire CMB is blanketed in these subducted materials, which could potentially make a case for a global ubiquitous ULVZ across the core-mantle boundary. So just to summarize, and I'm getting a little short on time, we've developed using this new HIPPR-based weighting scheme. We generated high-quality P and PCP waveform stacks for data recorded by the Antarctic TAMNet array. We do, of course, have modeling trade-offs that make it a little difficult to specify the exact ULVZ characteristics in any one area, but our results provide strong evidence for ULVZ structure throughout the southernmost hemisphere, though that structure is geographically variable from place to place. Our study area, again, is located within a seismically fast, presumably colder part of the lowermost mantle, again, away from those LLSVPs, which isn't quite as consistent with a thermal origin that has been suggested in the past. And as I just showed you from the geodynamic models, it's very plausible that the lowermost mantle in this area may be covered in compositional heterogeneities from past subduction, of course, with variable accumulation and variable distribution, which is consistent with our ULVZ observations. and potentially could be expanded to explain global ULVZ observations as well. So I'll just briefly throw up the references that I used in this study in case anyone's interested in any of those. This, not to plug my own work too hard, but this is my 2021 JGR paper that I've mentioned a few times about the HIPPR process. And with that, I will wrap this up and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Hansen. I have one question. So if it can be proposed that there might be a ubiquitous low ultra low velocity zone, and you did your study in seismic a cooler portion, what would be any like difficulties, or are you interested in doing another study in seismically the opposite, the hotter area?
So there have been a lot of studies done in the vicinity of the large low shear velocity provinces, actually probably a lot more so than in colder parts of the world, colder parts of the lower mantle. The concept that you might have a ubiquitous ULVZ is a little in the face of some of those studies, because if you recall, there was that map I showed you with prior investigations, and there were kind of blue areas on there where they didn't find ULVZs. So this would kind of indicate that their interpretation was wrong. But I don't think it's that the case that they're necessarily wrong. I think that you could have a variable thickness ULVZ. All seismic probes have a resolution threshold and how thick or thin a layer they can pick up. And so it's very likely that it just may be in a given area that it's too thin for that particular method to resolve. And so if we do have a ubiquitous ULVZ, I think it has a lot of variability in place to place in terms of its thickness and its characteristics. You have a lot of temperature variations along the core-mantle boundary that feed into that. There's other mineralogies at play, and I can get into that if people are interested. But it has some really cool implications, and I'm biased, but of course, because it has a lot of potential impacts as far as heat flux out of the core, what are the interactions and the chemistry between the mantle and the core, and like, what does all that mean? So I think it's definitely something to think about a little bit more, maybe investigate a little further.
Thank you.
I noticed the chat popped up here. Oh, okay, got the answer. Never mind.
I have a quick question. Thank you for a really great talk. Have you thought about using machine learning techniques such as convolutional nets to detect these more, almost hidden core phases?
So it's not something we've tackled yet. Right now, my kind of next step of this project is I only use data from one network in Antarctica. I have a grad student who I've given the rather ominous task of taking all the data from Antarctica to look at ULVZ structure. And we're starting to narrow that down. It's a little tough though, because machine learning, of course, is looking for patterns, right? And because the signal you get from a ULVZ can be quite variable, again, given what the specific structure is, how thick it is, what's the change in characteristics, the pattern or the signal that you're going to get is not necessarily always the same. The other issue is we're doing 1D modeling, and of course, these are not 1D features. And so when you start factoring in sort of the three-dimensionality of all of this, that kind of plays into the complications as well. And so part of it is getting a data set that you feel is confident enough to represent the suite of data for ULVZ signals that machine learning is going to adequately go in and find these, right? It's a pattern recognition issue. And at least to my knowledge, we might be walking in that direction, I think, as we expand deep earth investigations, but at least at this stage, it's not something that specifically has come up, at least as far as I know.
Right. No, yeah, I agree that, so getting a good training data set, right? That's going to be sort of the key of or part of the key of the issue. So yeah, I wonder, because you have really good synthetic data, if you can augment that and tweak that a little bit and use that to train the model and then apply it to the data, because I'm sure you don't. So for usual, P and S phase picking, we can just use the analyst picks. There is no such a data set, right, for these deeper core phases, but potentially using synthetic data might work, just to get the spectrograms of those and using a convolutional neural net. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's something that could be played with and thought about. Yeah. My brain immediately is like throwing all the little flags of like, but then you're gonna have this problem, this problem, and this problem. But like, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I mean, I think, especially if we collected data from various studies. The one thing is so like, for example, in this particular study, I was using PCP phases. In an earlier study, I happened to look at SCP, and we might be pulling that into the next study too. Not all of the studies that I showed you in that previous studies map were done with core reflection. Some of them were done with diffracted phases and other approaches. And so combining the observations from one kind of probe with another gets a little challenging as well. So for any one particular seismic phase that's used to investigate this type of structure, you have a good data set, you don't have a great data set. And that'll get better with time as we continue to move this forward. But there are some challenges there. So.
Can I ask you a question? Thanks for the cool talk, by the way. So you introduced in one of the earlier slides, this iron enrichment might be associated with ultra-low velocity. So this, and probably it's also related to, well, considered as a higher temperature than the surrounding. So do you know any causative relationship between this iron enrichment and higher temperature? So one can induce the other?
Okay, so I'm going to preface this with I am not a geochemist.
Okay.
And most of we're in the process of writing a paper on everything I showed you today. And one of my other colleagues, Dan Shim at Arizona, is my go-to mineralogy guy and geochemistry guy. He himself kind of has issues with the iron enrichment idea. And again, this is his thing, this is not a my thing, but his comment to me was, yes, it's been proposed, it's been published in a couple of papers, but then they've had some trouble recreating it in the lab.
Okay.
And so he personally isn't real on board with that particular explanation. Something he came up with is that one of the dominant mineral compositions in the lowermost mantle is pyrrolite. And he's like, okay, well, if you're going to have a ubiquitous global ULVZ, what else could be causing that? And pyrrolite's kind of thought to be everywhere in the lower mantle. And again, under the right conditions, you could get partial melting. Some of his work and his colleagues' work have looked at the temperature conditions at which that partial melt might occur. It's a little bit up in the air still. There's a little bit of disagreement on whether it's hot enough there to actually get partial melting of pyrrolite. But assuming that you could, again, and you have variable amounts of partial melting depending on what the temperature is, but it could potentially lead to some contribution to all of this as well. Now that said, again, because the melting temperature is still a little bit unconstrained, and the density variations may or may not be there, morb and subducted materials have consistently been shown time and again to provide this denser compositional anomaly. So it could be that you have, sort of a contribution from these subducted materials, maybe mixed with some degree of partial melting of pyrrolite as well, to give you, some kind of variable layer. Unfortunately, that's probably all I'm going to be able to say about iron enrichment, because it is really not my forte.
All right, thank you. Yeah. And the main reason why you ran that geodynamic simulation to see, the subducted materials, how they are distributed over a core-mantle boundary, is that those material can play the role of a thermal blanket, and then if it's enough of a heat energy accumulate, then it will become ultra low velocity zone.
It's not so much of a thermal blanket and a thermal aspect per se. It's more that you have this compositionally distinct material that's ending up in the lowermost mantle. So if you remember the plot I showed you of the morb and how morb's density is expected to change with depth, again, it's been shown quite a few times that morb is significantly denser than sort of average lower mantle material. And so it could be that if you're mixing this compositionally distinct material into the lowermost mantle in different abundances and different thicknesses, you would get a wide range of variable anomalies along the core.
Mm-hmm. And the simulation shows that, over this about 500 million year period, they are going to be covered pretty much in all the CMB.
Pretty much, yeah.
But wouldn't it be nice to have, further correlation, for instance, thicker those subducted material is more likely to be the place for the ULVZ. And do you know that kind of relationship?
Meaning where you would expect more subduction?
Right.
And okay.
No. Where you see those more of the subducted material.
Is there a correlation?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we did look at that. Part of it is the assumptions that go into building those geodynamic models. And so the one that I showed you guys today, again, I'll mention that the tracers that indicate where that material is going are passively advected. And so there's different aspects of sort of the mantle chemistry and composition that aren't built into those. Additionally, like you said, the material is kind of distributed all over the area that was shown. And in that particular model, the large low shear velocity provinces were just set up as thermal anomalies. Now, if they are not just thermal, meaning they're they have some sort of compositional aspect to them, which a lot of people think is the case, the models actually look a fair bit different. The areas outside of the LLSVPs are very heavily covered in these subducted materials, but they don't really go into the LLSVPs very much. So you get sort of these like white areas on the map where you don't have as much subducted material. So depending on how you set up the model, kind of the assumptions that go into the model, how long you run it for, what plate tectonics motions you're using to drive it, you end up with kind of very, different results at present day. And so it's kind of difficult to make a one-to-one comparison of like, hey, we see really thick stuff here, you should see a ULVZ right in that spot, because that may or may not actually be showing today's true distribution of that material. But in a general sense, kind of looking at it with blurry eyes, if you will, this stuff is all over the place, or at least it has an indication of being pretty ubiquitous. And so it could provide a really interesting explanation for these structures.
Got it. Thank you.